Welcome to a very special episode of the Archetypal Mosaic. This is Mikhail. Today's guest is Professor Anne DeLong, Associate Professor of English at Kutztown University. She is author of Mesmerism, Medusa and the Muse, The Romantic Discourse of Spontaneous Creativity. Dr. DeLong is also co-editor of the Journal of Dracula Studies and the president of the Transylvanian Society of Dracula. Welcome.
Hello, thank you.
Now, Dracula. To many people, Dracula is a symbolism of darkness. And some people, of course, are afraid. Some people feel that it's romantic. What interested you in Dracula and the darkness originally?
Well, that's a fascinating question. Dracula, like many Gothic monsters, often serves as a metaphor for cultural anxieties. And a lot of my scholarship looks at cultural currents which inform the literature. So in the case of Dracula, certainly that character reflects a lot of the fears and the darkness that the Victorian society was afraid of.
Now, you have 3 books coming out, which is very exciting.
Yes.
The book that's coming out in June of 2018, which has just come out, is called A Historical Exploration of Literature, Classic Horror. Let's discuss that book first. Tell me, what inspired you to focus on the topics in this book, and how did you arrange that focus?
Okay, well, Classic Horror is part of a historical exploration of literature series by ABC Clio Publishers. These books look at the historical, economic, political context behind many works of classic literature. My book, Classic Horror, contains chapters on The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, Frankenstein, Strange Case of Jekyll and Hyde, and Dracula. And each chapter contextualizes the literary work through an examination of the history that was happening at the time.
The book, Classic Horror, is available through the publisher, which is abc-clio.com, correct?
Correct.
Okay, great.
And that is currently available for ordering through that website.
There's also an ebook edition available if you contact the publisher. Yes?
That's correct, yes.
Okay, the second book that's coming out soon, you have a chapter in it, and it's coming out in the UK from Liverpool University Press, called Bram Stoker and the Late Victorian World. Can you describe your chapter and the entire kind of thesis of the book?
Absolutely. This book, too, contextualizes the literature by Bram Stoker and looks at particular currents happening in the 1890s. My chapter is on communication technologies in Dracula. So I look at the rapidly changing technology, some real cutting-edge stuff like voice recorders and telegrams and things that would have seemed somewhat magical to the Victorians. So their world was changing rapidly, much like ours is, and the focus on communication technologies also has a lot of relevance for our own era.
The book will be available starting late December, basically almost the early 2019. It'll be released on December 31st, and it will be available through Liverpool University Press. Now, you also have a third book that's scheduled for tentative release for 2019. Can you briefly describe that?
Absolutely. That one is also coming out through ABC Clio, part of their historical explorations literature. That book will be called The Victorian World, and it contains chapters on Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, and a chapter on the social justice poetry of Elizabeth Barrett Browning. So that book also will contextualize those literary works through historical explorations. These books also contain excerpts from primary documents from the period. For example, my chapter on Dracula includes context from Thomas Edison on his invention of the phonograph, the voice recorder that Dr. Stewart uses. So it allows readers to have a sense of how the Victorians would have received these texts, and again, also draws parallels to relevant issues today.
Wonderful. Now, there's a Facebook page for the Journal of Dracula Studies, and that's what it's called if you search for it, Journal of Dracula Studies, which you can join and gather more information on what we will be discussing today. Now, Bram Stoker, his first name was Abraham, and it always interests me to get an opinion as to why, the publication, he's known as Bram, which is very like non-religious specific, which is Abraham is very kind of Jewish specific. Do you have any suggestions or opinions on why the AB was kind of, the first part of it was removed?
That's an interesting question. Bram Stoker, of course, was Irish. He did most of his writing and other work he was a theater manager for the Lyceum Theatre in London. So he was an immigrant in a sense. He was an Irish citizen living and working in London. As far as the religious connotation, there may be some effort to distance himself from that, but interestingly enough, one of his heroes in the novel Dracula is Abraham von Helsing, who many have suggested is sort of one of the avatars of the author himself. And he does give him the full name of Abraham.
Interesting. Now, the archetype of Dracula. Of course, there was Vlad the Impaler, and then there was the fictionalized, completely different version, which we know as Dracula. Now, if we talk about the archetype of Dracula, what is that archetype, and how can people, what is it about it that makes it timeless?
Well, first of all, the reference to Vlad the Impaler has probably been overstated. Stoker did use the name Dracula, which was one of the nicknames given to Vlad Tepes. It means in Romanian, it translates to son of the devil or son of the dragon. From everything we can tell, he pretty much came across the word and thought it was a cool name. He didn't do a whole lot of research on Transylvania. But, in terms of the vampire archetype, Stoker did read Emily Gerard's book on Transylvania. Emily Gerard was the wife of a British officer who lived in Eastern Europe and wrote about the customs there. So she would have been the person from whom he heard about things like Nosferatu and some of the myths connected to the undead, which go back really to ancient times.
Now, what about Dracula as we know him fictionally? He lives in our unconscious, collectively, individually. There have been so many, reproductions of his archetype through vampire movies and stuff. So my question to you is, it's an endless living, breathing archetype, and it started with Bram Stoker. What is the power behind it to make it so powerful now as it has always been?
That's a great question. It's a very malleable archetype. As we mentioned earlier, it speaks to a lot of cultural fears. Fears about foreigners, fears about sexuality, fears about power and politics and losing your sense of control. All of those issues remain relevant, so they can be sort of mapped on to other kinds of cultures. So the figure does certainly work to develop our fears of the other, our fears of the monstrous, our fears of becoming the monster ourselves, and all of that, I think, continues to translate very, very well.
Do you believe that by placing our fears into an archetype, that it distances the fear and creates a way for us to communicate with it or kill it?
Yes, I think that's one of the functions of Gothic literature, this notion of othering the things which disturb us. However, there is always the sort of ambiguity that suggests that these fears are also within us and therefore a lot more difficult to get rid of.
When I was about 11, 12 years old, a whole theatrical system came to me called Dark Soul Theater. I've been doing it ever since, musically, theatrically, movie-wise. And what I've been trying to teach is the difference between darkness and negativity. Even this morning, I had some dark humor at a store, and somebody took it a little bit incorrectly. And so the question I have for you is, what is darkness?
Well, again, I go to that inner and outer paradigm. People tend to want to distance themselves from things that are fearsome. They want to pretend that bad things happen to those people over there, or that bad things happen in a way that can be explained or vanquished. And I think the Gothic genre reminds us that that's not always the case. We have these novels in which they're set in the real world. It's 19th century Victorian England, and yet, the darkness intrudes. The sort of the impossible supernatural it comes to the real world and forces people to confront on a metaphorical level those things that they fear. I do think that often the Gothic genre works to sort of upend what one thinks of as darkness. In the case of Dracula, certainly he's fearsome, but there's also something about him that's appealing. The sort of the fantasy genres that are so popular today also allow us to investigate dark desires, things that are considered taboo in respectable society. Supernatural literature can give us a way to sort of safely investigate the darkness.
Now, as you mentioned, Dracula had a charming side, a sexual side, a sensual side, a magnetizing mesmerism side. Let's talk about that for a bit. What makes darkness so appealing, and what is it about him that magnetized interest?
That's a good question as well. The Dracula of Stoker's novel is much more monstrous and much less sexy than, say, Bela Lugosi makes him. So I think that vampires do undergo a sort of a makeover in the 20th century, beginning even with those early films. The Todd Browning film that features Bela Lugosi, I think it was 1930s. Lugosi was a charismatic foreign Hollywood heartthrob type. So there is a sort of, like I said, a makeover that happens. In Stoker's novel, Dracula does have mesmeric powers, but he's simultaneously disgusting and repulsive, and there's a lot of ambivalence about his attraction, which is part of what makes it scary.
Now, what about the role of the female archetype, females and the intersex? How are they seen in terms of the interplay between Dracula and themselves?
Well, in Dracula's novel, we have essentially, or in Stoker's novel rather, we have essentially two women that act as foils, the characters of Mina and Lucy. Mina is more progressive than Lucy. She is the person who is essentially the editor of the text, almost a paradigm of the new woman archetype that was becoming popular in the 1890s. She's smart, she's capable, she has quite a bit of agency and voice. Lucy, on the other hand, one of Dracula's early victims, is presented as the sort of more conservative version of traditional femininity. So Stoker, I think, is engaging with changing attitudes about women and their roles in the late 19th century.
That's beautiful. And has that ever been published, that particular focus?
Oh, absolutely, yes. A lot of the scholars whom we publish in the Journal of Dracula Studies continue to look at Stoker's novel. The Journal of Dracula Studies publishes articles on the figure of the vampire in fiction, film, and folklore. So not just Dracula, but lots of other vampires as well. So we've published works that look at more recent incarnations, the Anne Rice novels, the Twilight series, True Blood television, based on the Charlaine Harris novels. So people do continue to look, for sure, at issues having to do with gender, with sexuality, in all of those archetypal stories. Again, it's another area that can be investigated relatively safely through the supernatural.
Are there any conferences that are in tandem with the publishings?
There was something that went on that may become an annual event in Romania, the IVFAF, the International Vampire Film Festival. There are other events that take place in America as well, but none that we sponsor specifically.
Now, let's
Our
talk...
journal. Oh, go ahead.
Go, please,
Sorry.
go ahead.
I was just going to say our journal is published once a year in the fall, and it is also available through the Facebook page, or one can join the Transylvanian Society of Dracula to become to receive an issue of the journal each year.
I'm happily a member of your society, and when a long time ago I used to be a member of the Canadian one, and my trip to Transylvania was published in the Borgo Post back then, which I cherish.
Yes. Our Canadian scholar Elizabeth Miller is the founder of the Journal of Dracula Studies. She founded the journal in 1999, and then my colleague Kurt Herr and I took over editing it in 2008. And we had Elizabeth Miller to campus to deliver a lecture on Dracula back in 2008 when we first began publishing the journal there. So it is also a feather in the cap to Kutztown. It is published on campus, and we also give our students an opportunity to get involved in copy editing. So that's pretty exciting for them.
Yeah, that's a wonderful way to express this. Now let's discuss your favorite editions. The very first edition ever published. Have you held it? Do you have it? How does it feel?
I don't. I don't own it. I have not held it. I actually have been working with some later editions. The Norton Critical Edition, for example, which provides context, is one of my go-tos. There is also a volume by Bedford St. Martin's, which is presents case studies in contemporary criticism as well. But no, I am not an owner of the original, unfortunately.
Wow, perhaps one day, if I ever can afford it, I'll get you and I a copy.
Oh, wouldn't that be nice?
Tell me,
wouldn't that be something?
What so far? What is your favorite, beloved copy of Dracula that you possess?
Yeah, well, I'm going to have to go back to the Norton Critical.
Okay.
Although not all of the footnotes are completely accurate, and that's part of the fun to continue to debate some of the scholarly interpretations of Dracula. But there's a very interesting story about the original manuscript that is connected to Pennsylvania, from where I am currently speaking. Do you know it?
Okay. Oh, you're in Transylvania right now?
No, I'm in Pennsylvania right now. But there's a Transylvania connection. In the 1980s, the original manuscript of Dracula was discovered in a Pennsylvania barn.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Apparently, Stoker had sent it to Walt Whitman as a gift, but in the interim, Whitman had passed away, and it ended up with his lawyer, and it ended up with the lawyer's family in some in an old trunk in the attic. So how about that?
That's amazing. Where is it now?
Yeah. It was sold twice. It was sold at Sotheby's. It went to auction there, I think, for $500,000. This was back in the 80s. It was recently sold again. I don't remember the buyer, but it has been acquired privately.
Now tell me, do you know of, two questions here. Do you know of anything that's been edited out of the original manuscript or anything majorly altered? Well, that original manuscript had the title, The Undead, which is one of the reasons why the family who discovered it did not know what they had. The last-minute change of the character to Dracula and the title of the work to Dracula happened very late, just before publication. Who was responsible for the change in the title? That was Stoker. He originally was calling his character Count Vampire. Kind of an obvious giveaway. Wampyr. Very cute.
Spelling. And he went to he used the Romanian word for son of devil or son of dragon at the last moment, and also decided to change the setting to Transylvania. Those were some last-minute changes. I think if it was called Count Vampire, it would be kind of comical. It's kind of silly. Yeah, it's sort of like I said, a giveaway. Incidentally, the working notes for Bram Stoker's novel are housed at the Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia, and we have recently inaugurated an event where we launch the journal there each fall. So that is another interesting Transylvania connection. Wow, that would be a great
book in itself, Pennsylvania, Transylvania.
There you go.
Let me ask you, so is there any parts, are you familiar with anything edited out of the book?
Yes, there is one very important omission near the end. Dracula, Stoker had originally included a paragraph in which Dracula's castle imploded and vanished upon his death there at the end of the novel. And again, there are some who question whether or not Dracula is actually vanquished. Anyway, Stoker took out that paragraph. He left the ending kind of open. Interestingly enough, I don't know that he could have foreseen this, but it enabled the growth of the tourism industry in Romania. There are a ton of places that call themselves Castle Dracula. So to choose to leave the thing standing was, had some far-reaching implications.
Now, was there ever a sequel written and not published?
There was a sequel written by David Stoker, who is the, I believe, great-grand-nephew of Bram Stoker, and Ian Holt. That was published a few years back. But Stoker himself did not do a sequel of Dracula. And
this sequel that was published, what's it called again, and what do you think about it?
It is The Undead. I believe the title is The Undead, Dracula 2. It is highly sensationalized. It's not quite the direction that one might have expected a sequel to go, but it is interesting.
Now, have you been working on your own Dracula edition with your own notations and maybe even a secondary book?
I have not, although a few years ago, my colleague Kurt Herr and I did an online edition with Copia, which was a critical edition in which readers as well as scholars were allowed to comment. But we never put that into print. That was something that was available online.
Now, when we return back in the conversation to Vlad the Impaler, who some say the character was based on, now, he used to impale the Turks, among others, on poles and spears, and I'm wondering, isn't that so related to teeth?
Related, but kind of counterintuitive. I mean, in a sense, according to vampire legends, then someone like Vlad the Impaler is more likely to be a vampire slayer than a vampire, since that was one of the legendary methods that one could kill a vampire. No, I think Stoker liked the name. He liked the sort of exotic. Transylvania was already a sort of established Gothic setting for legends of that sort. He was going to originally set his vampires coming from Styria, which is where Sheridan Lithgow's Carmilla, an earlier vampire tale, hailed from. So I think that he did a little bit of research on Transylvanian history, but he never references the name Vlad Tepes in Dracula.
Now, at this time, Transylvania is part of Romania, and I actually had a chance to stay at a council estate. At that time, was Transylvania part of Hungary or Romania or something else?
I believe it was something else, and it goes through a series of political upheavals. One of the titles of Vlad was Prince of Wallachia. So there are a series of kingdoms, a series of tribes sort of battling for political control of the area during the time that Stoker was writing.
Let's briefly discuss a few symbols here. Bats, water, snakes, and dragons. So his familiar, in a way, from a witch's perspective, would be a bat, right? He turned into a bat.
Yes. Yes. I tell my students, when Stoker writes bird, read bat, and when Stoker writes dog, read wolf. Often these animals are somewhat disguised upon their first appearance in the novel. But yeah, shape-shifting is apparently one of his powers.
What is it about the bat, aside from, the darkness and sleeping upside down, all this stuff, and drinking blood? Is there anything more specific that related the two?
Yeah, well, there is a legend of vampire bats. I believe they come. The legends come from the Pampas, from Argentina. Herds of bats who can collectively take down a cow, for example. I don't know that one bat could do it, but apparently herds of them might have been formidable predators.
Now, in terms of, well, before we get to the other ones, when he was about to, he gave Mina the option, right, to either become, I don't really recall the ending. Could have she been a vampire as well? And then was the stake silver that killed him?
Yeah, she seems to be turning. Her behavior is altered. Presumably, Stoker's logic in regard to turning is a little bit ambiguous. But apparently, the band of slayers believe that if they vanquish Dracula, that all of his victims, if they're still alive, will go back to normal. Although if Mina dies before Dracula dies, she will become like him. So presumably, like I said, if he is vanquished, she is fine. But it is unclear. The ending is particularly unclear. They managed to sort of stab him with a knife and shear him through the throat at the same time. It's not exactly the beheading and staking that was supposed to happen. He dissolves into dust motes, which can be read as an annihilation, could also be read as another one of his sort of vanishing or shape-shifting tricks. Since earlier in the novel he appears in the form of dust motes and then materializes fully. So I suppose there is some room for ambiguity as the novel ends, and other sort of fan fiction continuations have developed the idea that Mina remains a vampire.
How do you see the ending when what is your ending of the book?
Yeah, I find it particularly ambiguous. It ends with a little vignette describing 5 years later, Mina has become a mother. She has a child whom they have named Quincy, because the child is born on Quincy's death date. It always strikes me that Quincy's death date was also Dracula's death date, and if Quincy's spirit has somehow passed into this child, well, then, why not also Dracula's? So yeah, I think that that's one of the things that leaves the possibilities for a sequel open.
That reminds me of Rosemary's Baby immediately.
Yes.
Is there any kind of correlation between Dracula and the devil?
Well, again, the name Son of the Devil, Son of the Dragon, does sort of seem to speak to just a formidable kind of dark opponent. As far as actual religious implications, in Stoker's novel, there are Christian symbols that can ward him off. The crucifix, the communion wafer, those sorts of items. So there does seem to be a suggestion that he is an enemy to religion, or an enemy from a religious standpoint, I guess.
Then there's and any significance to the stake being silver?
Well, the silver stake is not part of Stoker's novel. In Stoker's novel, the stake is wooden, and that is specified. The silver bullets come into play in some werewolf legends that I think come along a little bit later. The wooden stake does seem to be a way to sort of still, it is to be driven through the vampire's heart, and then the vampire is also to be beheaded in order to prevent him from rising again. So the wooden stake may have to do with the actual sort of physical notion of nailing something down.
And like Rasputin, who is another figure who really interests me, and I have a movie that I've been working on about him, there's many, there's about quite a few tries to kill him. How many exact amount of, let's, stake him, let's chop him, let's turn him to dust. How many things happen until supposedly he vanished?
Yeah, it's those two things simultaneously at once. It's, I believe, Jonathan Harker and one of the other slayers, Dr. Seward, who sort of simultaneously stab him in the heart and I believe the text says shear him to the throat. Again, is that enough? It seems it seems unclear at the end.
Now, do you any idea of what kind of wood the stake was made out of?
No, I don't believe that is specified. Although there is a reference, Von Helsing makes reference to the rowan and the ash as I think particular types of wood that would have been that would have had a patropaic or warding sort of properties.
Now, blood and water. There's so much blood and there's so much water in this. And what are the influences of that? The archetypal meanings.
Well, it's interesting. Some of the limitations on Dracula's power involve water, involve tides. He can only cross at the full or the slack of the tide. He can only cross a body of water. So he has to sort of negotiate the way he travels with those kinds of tides and currents in mind. So there does seem to be a kind of pull of his native soil. He smuggles boxes of dirt with him from Transylvania that he can rest on. So water as a barrier certainly comes into play. Holy water specifically is one of those religious words that is used as a weapon against him. In that respect, the water becomes almost one of the pure symbols that can be used to fight him. Blood is very interesting, both physically and metaphorically in Stoker's novel. Of course, when Lucy is being fed upon, the heroes are desperately trying to save her by giving her blood transfusions. Now, of course, this is happening before blood typing was discovered in the early 20th century, so, the chance that they would have all been donors is pretty slim. Given, the sort of jump in the science aside, there are curious relationships that are drawn about blood, sort of curious superstitions that involve what blood means, or that the sharing of blood means other things in terms of human relationships. For example, Arthur, one of Lucy's suitors, he is the only one of the men who has noble blood. He is a lord, or becomes one when his father dies. His blood is considered preferable to the rest. So there are certainly odd markers about blood and class, about blood and relationships that also come into play.
It was interesting. I learned that the term blue blood came from the fact that aristocrats would eat from from silverware, literally, and the silver would tint the blood blue slightly, which was quite lovely. Now, what tint do you think Dracula's blood was?
Oh, that's an interesting question. We do see it. We see it in the scene when Nina is being forced to feed off of him, and it's described as red. I believe Seward and Von Helsing burst in upon, this sort of, was almost a rape scene, really. Dracula holding Nina to his chest and forcing her to almost nurse from him, and the blood that runs down is gorily red. Because when people are vilified or demonized, they're outcast and diminished, kind of like Dracula was by society. But in a different society, in a different mindset, perhaps a little bit more emotional intelligence, maybe he would have very well fit in. It's quite possible. Although one of the things that's disturbing about him, the way Stoker writes him, is that he appears to have imperialistic intentions of his own. His agenda is to not only assimilate and blend in to London, which seems pretty innocent, but to multiply, to take over, to sort of stake his claim. Later incarnations of vampires are definitely more sympathetic. True Blood comes to mind in terms of playing them as the other in a way that suggests that society really needs to get on board with acceptance and tolerance.
Beautiful. Now, as we kind of begin to wrap up the interview, I want to talk about dragons and your travels. What is it about dragons, that connotates evil or the devil, and what is it about it that relates to Dracula?
Oh, that's an interesting question, too. Well, again, in archetypal terms, this is the sort of fantastic monster. It is a staple in British myth in terms of, the enemy that must be vanquished. Dragons, like snakes, probably have pagan references. So those early Christian crusaders who were vanquishing monsters were actually killing heathens or people who were not Christians. So the dragon, like the snake, becomes a metaphor for the other in a religious sense.
Great. And now let's briefly discuss your travels to Transylvania. Approximately how many times have you gone, and what has really,
Oh, I have not. I have not traveled to Transylvania, unfortunately. I have not had that opportunity.
Wonderful. And so what kind of things are you interested in doing to further your incredible work with Bram Stoker and Dracula?
Well, we certainly intend to continue with the Journal of Dracula Studies, which again continues to be very popular. We receive submissions every year from scholars from all over the world, and we publish at least 4 or 5 articles each year. So I will certainly continue that work. The Transylvanian Society of Dracula is a nonprofit organization that the main purpose of which is to publish the journal, but we also bring scholars together to share their views on vampire literature and vampires in pop culture. My work as a teacher at Kutztown University involves some Gothic literature courses as well. I have created a course entirely on ghost stories, which continues to be very popular. So certainly I hope to be able to continue to use Gothic and supernatural literature as a metaphor to discuss current cultural issues.
And Dr. DeLong, again, has published several books. The newer one, which is available currently, is called Classic Horror, A Historical Exploration of Literature, which is available through the publisher abc-clio.com. The upcoming book has a chapter by Dr. DeLong called Bram Stoker and the Late Victorian World, to be published by Liverpool University Press, and a third book coming out in 2019, which is called, does it have a tentative title?
It does. The Victorian World, Historical Explorations of Literature, also will be available through abc-clio.com.
Yes, you did mention that at the beginning. Thank you for saying that again. What else would you like to share with our audience about your extensive knowledge about Dracula and Bram Stoker?
Well, just a plug perhaps for my current work. I am currently writing a book on ghost stories by Victorian women writers, tentatively titled Feminist Gothic. That may be forthcoming in 2019 as well. So I continue to focus a lot of my personal scholarship through a feminist lens, and I am looking forward to examining works by women authors, a lot of which deserves more critical attention.
Beautiful. It's been a true pleasure having you on the Archetypal Mosaic and discussing this extraordinary topic.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much.